Welcome, comrades, to our special session tonight in the LLA Education series. We thought it might be interesting to take a look at the US midterm elections, and quite right, we were quite right. It turns out they're more surprising or less dramatic, as Dan just explained, than perhaps expected. Not all the results are in, as Dan will now explain to us. Dan Lazare is a Marxist who lives in the US, and we're very pleased to have him with us tonight to explain what's going on. He'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we have time for questions and contributions from the floor. Hi, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So this is really great talking to this group because it's a lot of fun explaining American politics to people who are not American. And the funny thing is that Brits don't understand how the American system works, and Americans don't understand how the British system works. They are just two very different systems and kind of mutually incomprehensible. But so for a British audience, the first thing to bear in mind is that what we had on Tuesday was not an election. It was literally thousands of separate elections. In America, elections are run by the states and the local communities. And there are literally thousands of them. In fact, there's something like 90,000 state and local governments in the United States. It's a government by swarm. And in the US, that means that you're going to have different voting regulations, different regulations for qualification in order to vote. The local politics will differ extraordinarily. And certainly, you'll have dozens and dozens of races that are considered newsworthy, in addition to literally hundreds more, which are sort of below the radar in terms of the national media. And the other thing that's important to understand about American politics is that elections are not called by Congress. They take place according to a rigid timetable. And that may seem like a minor detail, but it actually leads to has certain very fundamental political effects. That means that a hot issue, which may have erupted, say last June or July, which in the U.S. was abortion, due to the fact that the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, the epic 1973 ruling legalizing abortion, and essentially allowed states to ban abortion, one of the most important Supreme Court rulings in decades. That ruling occurred in late June, and it was very hard to judge what the impact of that ruling would be on an election that was essentially 4 months later. And in the meantime, inflation had erupted as an extremely important issue. So the important thing is that elections are not called in response to the major issues of the day, but their timing is set in stone, and essentially the issues themselves rise and fall in unpredictable manner. So, given all that, let's get to what happened on Tuesday. These are the midterm elections, not presidential elections. They were elections for 1/3 of the Senate, the U.S. Senate, the upper chamber, which has 100 members, and for all members of the House, the lower chamber, which has 435 members. The lower chamber is somewhat more democratic, but the upper chamber is actually more powerful. Even though it's less democratic, which is, of course, one of the problems with the U.S. system. So going into the election, the abortion issue seemed to have subsided. It was, slipping into the past. Inflation was heating up and was causing a great deal of fear and concern. And Joe Biden was every bit as unpopular as he always has been. People just don't like Joe Biden. They think he's senile. They think he's kind of a bumbler. So therefore, it seemed like the race would be a referendum on the economy and on Joe Biden himself, with abortion as a relatively minor issue. And therefore, given those factors, it was thought that the Republicans would win handily. Well, the chemistry was a bit different. First of all, abortion is still a major issue, a very powerful issue, one whose impact has not subsided substantially since the Supreme Court's ruling on June 24th, I believe it was. And that was very important in generating support for the Democrats, who in general are the party in favor of abortion rights, and generating hostility to the Republicans, who identify very strongly with the anti-abortion movement. Inflation is bad, Joe Biden's unpopular, and there was also the January 6th factor. January 6th was the January 6, 2021 was the Capitol Hill insurrection, when a mob of hundreds of thousands of people invaded Capitol Hill and went rampaging through the Capitol, the building containing the halls of Congress and the Senate. It was a very dramatic moment in American history. In some ways, the most important political insurrection since the Civil War, and was very plainly, even though the idea was poo-pooed in certain quarters, was very plainly an attempted coup d'etat by Donald Trump. Trump's goal was to terminate the approval of the vote tally that had been tallied up by each state, and thereby, according to the Constitution, throw the contest into the House of Representatives, where under rules dating from 1803, the Republicans would enjoy certain key advantages. So Donald Trump wanted to terminate the certification process, throw the contest into the House, and thereby, win a second term, despite losing by 7 million votes, 7 million popular votes. So this was really an epic moment in American political history, but it was very difficult to judge what the impact on that would be in terms of elections that took place nearly 2 years later. Most people, most pundits, assume the effect would be relatively small, because Americans have short memories, and so many important things had happened in the meantime. This was also incorrect. It's quite clear that the shadow of January 6th still lingers over American politics. The Republicans essentially have reinvented themselves as the party of the insurrection. If they don't actually endorse the insurrection, they oppose Democratic Party efforts to make a big deal about it. So that sort of qualifies them as kind of more or less sidling up to the insurrection. So the contest therefore took on a very important ideological cast, in that it was a contest over democracy, really. In other words, should there be some kind of should the Republicans be punished for their support of January 6th, as I said, an attempted coup d'etat, or should they be rewarded? So for all those reasons, the election turned into a referendum on January 6th, on abortion, on the economy, and on Trump himself, and maybe to a degree also on the war in Ukraine. So what happened? Like most of you, I'm sure, I have a strong bias in favor of the dramatic. I like big events. I like decisive outcomes. I like, a good, rousing victory, or if necessary, if so be it, a strong defeat. I sort of hate the middle ground. But that's what the election was. The election was essentially a great muddle. The expected red wave in America, red is the color of the Republican Party, even though it's the right-wing party. The expected red wave did not materialize. It looks like the Republicans will essentially achieve a majority in the House of perhaps 15 or 20 seats. The Democrats currently have a majority of about 9 seats, a very slender majority. The Republicans will probably emerge from this whole thing once the votes are counted with a 20-seat minority or thereabouts. The Senate is up in the air, but my best guess, the reason it's up in the air is that 2 contests in Nevada and Arizona are still undecided. It's unclear how they'll go. And a third contest in Atlanta and Georgia is so close it's going to go into a runoff election on December 6th. But my best guess is that the Republicans will win those 2 races, and they will win the runoff as well in Georgia, and therefore will emerge with a very slender 51-seat majority, a one-vote majority in the Senate. They'll have 51 seats, or sorry, 2-vote majority in the Senate. They will have 51 seats to the Democrats' 49. So the Republicans did not perform nearly as well as expected, and the Democrats performed much better than expected. It was not a rousing victory by any means. The Republicans still came out ahead, but the Democrats held their losses. And in American politics, traditionally, the party that's in the White House usually braces itself for substantial losses in midterm elections. So the Democrats held their own while the Republicans eked out some small gains, and will have a small minority in one house, and perhaps even a smaller minority. A small majority in one house, and perhaps even a smaller majority in the other. So that's the results. But what does it all mean? So let's begin first of all. I have an article in the Weekly Worker that just came out today, in which I say that the main takeaway from the election is that the Trump bubble has burst. This seems, I wrote this article yesterday, and I'm as equally convinced, of its accuracy 24 hours later. Trump did very poorly in the election. He had the one candidate he endorsed, a best-selling author named J.D. Vance, who was running for senator in Ohio, won handily. But all the other candidates he endorsed either did poorly to various degrees. Some of them may sneak in, but still may sneak in. But in general, races that were expected to be clear wins are now going down to the wire and are still too close to call at this point. Trump, of course, was the architect of January 6th. Donald Trump is completely unrepentant. He's defiant. He's triumphant about his role on January 6th. He repeats at every opportunity that the 2020 election was stolen due to massive fraud by the Democratic Party. There is zero evidence of this, by the way, and Trump efforts to overturn the results in the courts have gone absolutely nowhere. But Trump essentially, made this his rallying cry. And because he so thoroughly dominates the Republican Party, that became the party's rallying cry as well. And the important fact is that this message did not do well. Some Trump supporters will win, some election deniers will win, but the important thing is that those two themes proved to be a drag in terms of getting votes. So Americans clearly reject the Trump message that the 2020 election was stolen. They clearly want to hold him accountable for the attempted coup d'etat. And so therefore, pro-Trump candidates underperformed. That's the word of the day here in the US. And that's important for a lot of reasons. I mean, one reason it's important is it means that it's essentially a vote of confidence in democracy. Now, admittedly, it's a razor-thin vote of confidence in democracy, but nonetheless, Americans, the majority of Americans, it seems, clearly, believe in elections, believe that elections should be respected, believe that elections should determine government policies, et cetera, and don't like to see elections overturned through, via attempted coups. That's very, very important. So on the good side, this represents an important rejection of the increasingly authoritarian and maybe even verging on fascist message that Trump was trying to get across. Another very positive thing that came out of the election is that abortion rights were strengthened in 3 states where at least one where they've been under serious threat. But the state of Vermont, for example, approved a referendum in Vermont, which is Bernie Sanders' home state, approved a new language in the state constitution declaring that an individual's right to personal reproductive autonomy is central to the liberty and dignity to determine one's own life course and shall not be denied or infringed unless justified by a compelling state interest achieved by the least restrictive means. So 3 states essentially ringingly affirmed their support of abortion rights, despite a truly epically dreadful Supreme Court ruling in June and a long-term campaign by the Republican Party and right-wing forces to narrow this right and even overturn it. And so that is a clear victory for progressive forces. But let me go through some of the other implications of what the elections mean for the left and for the working class. First of all, assuming that if I'm correct that the Republicans gain control of both houses, both the House and the Senate, then we're in for an intensified period of institutional warfare in Washington. And when I say intensified, we have had institutional warfare for 30 years in the United States. I mean, gridlock on Capitol Hill, a non-shooting civil war, Cold War, however you want to describe it. Government has been immobilized more often than not. It's been frustrating, infuriating, demoralizing, and undemocratic as well, because it essentially means that that the people, their organs have been essentially blocked. The organs of popular rule have been blocked. So given all that, we can now expect that kind of institutional combat to actually intensify, because the Republicans will control the legislature, the Democrats will control the executive branch, Republicans will also control the Supreme Court. And so essentially, Joe Biden will be doing combat against three major Republican controlled institutions. And that will send tempers shooting through the roof. And one reason it will is that you have to remember, that America, thanks to its crazy 18th century Constitution, is now in the middle of a period of intense minority dictatorship. In other words, the Electoral College, which determines the presidency, is heavily biased towards white, rural, underpopulated states. The Senate is even more heavily biased in that direction. The Republicans have parity currently with the Democrats. They each have 50 seats. But even though the Republicans, due to this basic structural bias, represent 45 million fewer Americans, that's roughly 12% of the US population. And in the House, due to a ruthless gerrymandering at the state level, Republicans enjoy roughly an 11% advantage in House elections. And if anyone's interested, I can go into the details about how I calculated that number, but it's true. And in the Supreme Court, the conservatives now have a 6-3 majority, which will likely persist well into the 2030s. But it's important to bear in mind that of those 6 conservative justices, 4 were chosen by unelected presidents, i.e. Trump or George W. Bush back in the early aughts. And 4 were also approved by senators representing a minority of the US population. Just the US system requires presidents to nominate Supreme Court justices who are then confirmed in a majority vote in the Senate. But remember, a majority of senators does not mean a majority of the US population, given the Senate's gross malapportionment. So essentially, we'll have Republicans controlling a Republican minority, a well-placed Republican minority controlling 3 of the most important governing institutions in Washington, while Democrats essentially cling on to a 4th, the presidency. And that means that we can get set for a period of really bitter infighting. I think it's a pretty good bet the Republicans will try to will definitely impeach Biden, assuming they get a majority in the House, since impeachment only requires a majority vote. And they'll probably impeach him on corruption charges, in that there's pretty ample evidence that he essentially was part of his son Hunter's business efforts to use his official position to make money. So that's a classic case of corruption. To me, it looks like the evidence against Biden is pretty fairly solid, actually. And so we can expect the Republicans to make the most of this. So we'll probably see an impeachment trial. We'll probably see a parade of witnesses, testifying to Joe Biden's involvement in his son's business activities. We'll see a polarized press. We'll see furious talking heads on TV, and then we'll probably see a vote to impeach Biden, at which point it will go to the Senate for a trial. And the Senate, unless the evidence is really just completely overwhelming, will almost certainly vote to acquit. But nonetheless, the process are guaranteed the process is guaranteed to drive passions to the breaking point. So we're in for a period of renewed civil war. The other thing that's important is that because the Republicans will control both houses, as it currently looks, they will be able to set the legislative agenda. That means that there'll be a lot of struggling back and forth between the White House and Congress, but essentially the White House will, in the final analysis, will have to do what the Republicans want it to do. That the long and short of it is that the Republicans, if they have majorities, will prevail. Therefore, we can expect a great deal of social regression, even as the combat on Capitol Hill heats up. We can expect reduced social benefits. We can expect declining conditions for the American working class, even as a recession sets in, which under the best of circumstances will be deeply punishing. And so essentially it'll be a very dark time for the working class, and there will be no way out of it short of a major labor eruption until the next round of elections in 2024. So we'll see reaction on the social front. On terms of foreign affairs, if Joe Biden had taken a real beating, we could have expected that his foreign policy, especially as it involves the war in the Ukraine, would have been called into question. But since Joe Biden emerged in relatively good shape, that means that the war will continue, and of course that's not something that I welcome. I think we can expect that support for the Ukraine will continue at a very high point. I doubt very much that Republicans will challenge it in any serious way, and so therefore any hope that the U.S. would moderate its point of view, and ironically, I'm looking to the right-wing party to serve as a moderating force in terms of this conflict. But any hope that the U.S. that a period of moderation might set in have those hopes been dashed. It's not going to happen. So we can expect the U.S. to continue with the current policy of all-out support for Kiev. And that also likely means that that West European support for the war will probably hold together for a while longer. I mean, there had been signs of fragmentation, of splintering, et cetera, but I think that the election results will actually wind up, at least for the short term, shoring up European support for the war, which I regard as very bad news, of course, because I think that the war is a disaster. I believe it was sparked by NATO. Vladimir Putin didn't help matters by launching his invasion on February 24th, a special military operation, which I think is indefensible. But nonetheless, I assign the lion's share of blame to NATO for due to its reckless eastward expansion, which Russia could not help but view as highly threatening. Believe me, if the shoe was on the other foot, things would be very different. The U.S. has taken extreme military action to rebuff comparable threats in its neighborhood, whether invading Cuba, invading the Dominican Republic, invading Mexico more times I can count, fostering horrendous repression, bloody repression in Central America, on and on and on. I'm sure the other participants in this session know the litany as well as I do. So I believe the lion's share of blame lies with NATO, and therefore I am sorry to say that these elections will probably buttress support for U.S. policies. So I guess that kind of sums up the impacts. We'll have we have the fact that Trump is weakened, that the Republican Party is in some disarray at this point, but that the Democratic position has been strengthened, but that in general we can look forward, if that's the right term, to social regression on Capitol Hill, and a period of ever more poisonous infighting, which sooner or later will lead to a constitutional rupture on the scale of January 6th, if not greater. So I guess that is the bottom line. The American constitutional system, which I've written a lot about in the Weekly Worker, is 235 years old. It dates from the period of powdered wigs and silk knee breeches. It is effectively unchangeable because tiny minorities, I'm saying states representing as little as 4.4% of the U.S. Population, are able to veto any constitutional alteration, however minor. So this hugely antiquated system, and one which promotes gridlock, is increasingly undemocratic in that it gives more and more power to an entrenched minority, a party which dates from the days of slavery and is still filled with massive, racial inequities. That this antiquated system is coming under growing stress. The stress is increasing regardless of the elections, and that someday, at some point, those stresses will reach a point where the entire system fractures. It already happened once in 2021. It could very well happen in 2024. We just don't know. These events are unpredictable, but we can be certain that it will happen sooner rather than later. So these elections are one mid-step in the entire process of ongoing breakdown. Their overall effects are mixed, some positive, some negative, but nonetheless, that does not alter the basic direction of U.S. politics, which are downhill, increasingly right-wing, and increasingly imperialistic in an especially reckless, frenzied, and dare I say, stupid manner. And so the crisis may seem to have been allayed for the moment, but I am 100% certain that it will continue to intensify even beyond the present levels. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was a really good overview, I think, an introduction. Bit depressing, but then you can't shine shit, as they say here. If it's bad, we'd rather hear the truth than having everything polished. Comrades, if you have a question or a comment, please click raise hand. And to get things the ball rolling, I do have a few questions for you. And I think I totally agree with your assessment of the war and unfortunately the role the Democrats are playing. I mean, Trump was actually kind of hoping that, not really for him to return, but he's not a hawk, was he? He wasn't interested in war against Ukraine, and he wasn't interested in a war against China. Under the Biden government, as crazy as it sounds, but the Democrats have been pushing this, no doubt. And as we've had recently an interview with Craig Murray, who was actually in Turkey when the Ukrainian and the Russian government were in peace talks, so they were starting, a few weeks into the conflict. And he said it was clear the Zelensky got a call from Biden, and he was told, you are continuing this. There shall be no peace negotiations. There's no compromise, whatever. You have to carry on. You have to push and push until this war is finished, basically, until Russia gives up, Putin is gone, whatever. So this is a really worrying time. And in your assessment, I mean, is this something that goes beyond Russia? I mean, obviously, you know, trying to get rid of Putin, etc. But do you think there's a sort of a proxy? Is this a proxy for dealing with China somewhere down the line? Is that what's going on from the US ruling class?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, Zbig Brzezinski, he was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor in the 70s, and the architect of the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan in the 80s, which essentially destroyed that country. He's the man who bragged that he actually lured the Soviet Union into its own Vietnam in Afghanistan. And, you know, and that they were very happy to see that happen. And as far as he was concerned, you know, Al-Qaeda and all the rest were a small price to pay for the humiliation of the Soviet Union and ultimately its destruction. So I think so. And in a famous book in 1997, I believe, called The Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski laid out a grand strategy. And the strategy was to ring Russia, post-Soviet Russia, with a circle of hostile states armed by the West, led first and foremost by the Ukraine, and essentially use that pressure to break Russia up into three parts: a Siberian Russia, a European Russia, and I believe a Urals Russia. I forgot exactly what it was. And then to make use of a weakened Russia as a springboard for American corporate interests into Central Asia, and then to use that as a base from which to make over China, essentially to Yeltsinize China. And I think this is a very important book. It was a bestseller, and that's very unusual for a foreign policy work of this sort. It was reviewed rapturously in all the mass media by all the most famous experts, you know, the most honored foreign policy gurus, and I think that those ideas are still current in the U.S. foreign policy. The goal is to topple Putin, certainly, maybe break up Russia, move heavily into Central Asia, which is now clearly in play, and then to use that as a means to essentially surround Russia on the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the Sea of Japan, etc., on one side, and then Kazakhstan, Xinjiang, Tibet on the other. And the goal is essentially to do a 1991, to break it up, to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party, install a bourgeois Boris Yeltsin style leadership, cripple it as a major military power, and essentially turn Eurasia into a U.S. I don't know, colony is probably too strong a word, but some kind of area of influence. I mean, I don't want to. I know this may sound terribly paranoid, but I really don't think it is. I think it actually this is what is on the back of the mind of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. Mm-hmm. Certainly, the Democratic Party. Remember, the Republicans are isolationists these days. The Democratic Party milieu is where all this thinking is taking place. Mm-hmm. That's the incredible thing. The neocons have never been stronger. The neocons have been strengthened, by the way, by the election. I mean, I don't know if you're aware. If people know who John Fetterman is, John Fetterman was the senatorial candidate in Pennsylvania.
Wears a hoodie.
He wears a hoodie, 6'9", at one point weighed 400 pounds, and suffered a stroke in May that left him with significant cognitive impairments. So he had a debate with a TV pitchman named Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania in late October. Although Fetterman had trouble squeezing out his words, he did squeeze out words calling for confrontation with China, blaming Oz for having some of the items he sells manufactured in China, saying he wanted to punch Putin, and called for unleashing American power against China. Jeez. And these are the Democrats. Yes, it really is amazing.
I mean, he's being presented as some kind of lefty here.
Precisely. And he's for abortion rights, and all the rest. And Mehmet Oz is a complete creep, believe me. But nonetheless, and so even someone like Fetterman, comes out with these very crude, very aggressive, anti-Russian, anti-Chinese sentiments. And this is across the board on the entire Democratic Party, without exception.
Talk about Bernie Sanders then quickly, because there's been some controversy, hasn't he, that he's been shouting at one of his advisors, paid by Russia or something, or one of his former advisors.
Oh, I didn't actually even know that, but Sanders was one of those who poo-pooed the idea that abortion would be important. He thought that that Democrats were making a mistake by campaigning too heavily on abortion issues, and that was really wrong. Bernie Sanders, by the way, he's a stark, raving mad leftist by American standards, but he is. But bear in mind that he's very mild by European standards. Yes. I mean, he's probably to the right of the Tory party. His foreign policy ideas are standard Democratic Party ideas. He has signed on to the whole Russia baiting episode, signed on to the whole idiotic conspiracy theory that Russia somehow threw the 2016 election. He is really the same. And of course, we had this big episode recently over this very timid letter released by 30 congressional progressives, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that they immediately yanked back when it ran into criticism. The letter was calling for negotiations, a negotiated way out of the conflict in the Ukraine, and Sanders said that he was glad they withdrew the letter because the letter was a mistake. They should pursue the war.
Is there an anti-war movement at all in the US then worthy of the name? Is there anybody opposed to war?
Only on the isolationist right. Yeah. Yes, I mean there are a few thousand people in major cities, but in national terms, it doesn't even register.
Yes, crazy, isn't it? You kind of, one hopes that the Democrats would get a beating to stop the war. Wish for the Republicans to win to stop this descent into possibly a nuclear World War III. I mean, it's absolute madness. Okay, we've got a few comrades who want to come in. Ken was first. Go on.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan, for that. A couple of questions. From this side of the pond, Kamala Harris appears to be more or less invisible in the midterm elections. I know she made an appearance in her native California, but she doesn't seem to have played any very strong role in this. Is that just a typical and traditional response from a vice president, or should any more be read into it? Was she trying potentially to distance herself from what might have been a defeat? And what do the results of the midterms imply for her prospects of standing instead of Biden at the next election? And sort of finally, I would be interested in the detail of how the Republicans managed to gerrymander that 11% advantage that you mentioned in your talk.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. I don't think that Kamala Harris kept herself aloof from the elections. I mean, her problem is that her polls are even worse than Joe Biden's. She's a distinctly unpopular person, of course, she hopes to head the Democratic ticket either in 2024 or 2028, but that strikes me as extremely unlikely because she is just not liked. I mean, during the 2020 primary elections, she was forced to withdraw because her support had essentially all but disappeared. She's very strident. She's not very intelligent. What's her name? Tulsi Gabbard, who was a Democratic candidate in early 2020, just demolished her during one debate when pointing out that although she supported marijuana legalization, as a state prosecutor, she had actually put thousands of marijuana violators in jail, and then laughed about it on a radio show when she was asked whether she had ever smoked marijuana herself. So it was an exercise in monumental hypocrisy, just completely repulsive, and all too common on the American political scene, I might add. Your second question was about what does this mean for 2024? Is that correct? Joe Biden said yesterday that he would run for re-election. I personally will bet $1,000 that he won't. I think there's no way that he will run for re-election, and the problem is the Democrats don't have any likely alternatives. There are no individual Democrats who generate excitement. Remember, Barack Obama was a very minor player when he was nominated in 2008. Really was an outsider, which is part of his appeal. Was nominated because he was young. He gave a great speech, obviously highly intelligent and a very attractive personality. And also, of course, he's Black, and that was actually a benefit in terms of a positive in terms of the political calculus. But there's no one, I can't see anyone of that ilk coming forward in 2024. So the Republicans will have the Democrats are faced with the problem. They have a president who is clearly can't run again, clearly is unfit for the job, clearly is too old, but they don't have anyone to replace him with. So they're in a real pickle. And finally, if you want to know how that calculation, I merely added up the total Democratic and Republican popular vote in congressional elections from 2010 through 2020. They haven't been put out for 2022 yet, and then divided them by the number of Republican and Democratic congressmen who were elected. And essentially, it means it took 12% more votes to elect a Democrat than to elect a Republican. So Republican votes travel farther, and that kind of analysis is pretty standard in American political science. And so that's it. So we've seen, thanks to state gerrymandering, a significant, important built-in advantage, even in the House of Representatives, which is allegedly the most democratic branch of the U.S. government.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Carol, please.
Yes, thanks, Tina. You've said, Dan, that the USA is actually run by a minority now. This is obviously totally undemocratic. How would the Constitution have to be rewritten to stop this? And how much chance is there of that ever happening?
No. And the chances of this Constitution, well, first of all, the Constitution is unchangeable. Second of all, it dates in the late 18th century when the idea of democracy was extremely undeveloped. It predates the French Revolution, as you know, by 2 years, as the Constitution was drafted in 1787. The fall of the Bastille was in 1789, obviously. Nowhere is the word democracy does it appear in the Constitution. And in fact, the entire logic of the Constitution is that a democracy is dangerous, threatening, akin to mob rule, ruled by the lowest and most dangerous elements, and therefore must be checked and balanced at every opportunity. And so this is completely bizarre. This is like completely important. And America is a country that entered into an unbreakable contract with itself 235 years ago. And as I said, that contract is unbreakable. It's like a pact with the devil. There is no way out of it short of revolution, where essentially the Constitution has got to be tossed out entirely and some kind of new democratic authority created, which can tackle the task of rebuilding the American political structure from start to finish. And of course, this is an effort which must and can only be led by the working class, who are the major victims of this increasingly unfair, oligarchical, and undemocratic system.
Thank you. A bit depressing, but thank you.
Well, it's depressing, but it's also, I mean, it's also good. I mean, America is at an impasse, and impasses are can be good because they force society to stop and think and to wrestle in a fundamental way without with what's happening, and that would be a huge opportunity for socialists who now are microscopic, but that could change. Anyway.
Good. Thank you.
Matthew, please.
Okay. Thanks, comrades. Yeah, no, it's very good. I think there's a couple of other things I was going to say. I mean, first of all, obviously, is the decline of the US. I mean, obviously the decline of the US economy and its reach as the imperial hegemon. We're looking at the decline of the US imperium, and this is where it becomes really dangerous, because they're now attempting to hold the whole thing together, not in the old way whereby they basically went around quietly and said to people, you've got to do this because we tell you, but actually going around hitting people over the head with military power, as a means to attempt an effort to try and hold together, the imperium, which is clearly disintegrating. The other thing I think is the corruption of US politics. I mean, the problem really is, I mean, after the Citizens United edicts by the Supreme Court, which is an extraordinary institution, incredibly anti-democratic, but very powerful, actually means that virtually all US politicians are bought. And it's obvious, because you can see, who buys them. If you track the money, although it becomes difficult with the use of like these dark money political action committees and all this sort of stuff. So this election, of course, has been incredibly expensive. I mean, I think they spent more money on this election than they did on the previous presidential elections. So the vast amounts of money have been spent on trying to stay in office. Which of course at the same time then excludes most of the population who don't have that kind of money. The whole thing becomes controlled and bought by the oligarchs. Interestingly enough, and it's saying that in Oregon, one of the guys who founded Nike has pumped in millions and millions and millions to try and get the Democrats out of Oregon. And he's nearly done it. So the other thing, of course, I think there's a couple of other factors as well. One is this sort of intense, first of all, of course, the racism of the US. The US system is profoundly racist. You know, it's one of the things, you know, and it constantly recurs, and it's done in different ways. And, you know, obviously now they've got to the point where they don't do it nakedly and openly like they used to, but they always do it with this dog whistle thing all the time. And it's always brought up, you know, in various ways by various people. But the system is just ingrained racism. And the other thing is misogyny. I mean, the edicts of the Supreme Court to get rid of abortion is, I mean, it's an incredible act. You know, the guy who wrote is it Alito who wrote the thing? He wrote the judgment. He was going back to sort of crazed 17th century jurisprudence in England, you know, which was of course nakedly misogynist, and said, well, you know, women are basically the agents of the devil, you know, and this has now been written into American law, you know, by the Supreme. It's just incredible stuff. You know, the depth of this, and you can see it runs through the whole the process in terms of, you know, the actions of the Republicans, but not merely them. I mean, the Democrats are nakedly using abortion. They have no real interest in actually preserving it. I mean, they could. I mean, Biden could do, you know, any number of things. I mean, he could have opened federal institutions for abortion. He could have defended it in a number of different ways. And they could have actually, they've had 50 years to write a law. And under conditions in which the Democrats have had majorities in both houses of Congress over a whole period. And at no point have they attempted to do so. So clearly they don't give a shit, really. But they use it as a method. It's another means of summoning people to vote for them. It's incredible. I think the last point also is the sheer depth of social decay you're looking at in the States. You know, we're basically, you know, I mean, it's bad enough, you know, you can see the marks here of what Thatcher did and so on, and what's been done in terms of the destruction of industry. But I mean, in the States, it's far worse. I mean, many of the most big cities are in a state of total collapse. I mean, Detroit, for instance, but not that alone. I mean, many other cities, you know, just complete, you know, collapse. Which has then meant that, of course, what the only social services then provided essentially by most of the cities is the police. You know, that you've got these you know, councils which essentially and local governments which spend, you know, half their money or more on cops in order to try and maintain the pressure on the working class. And these people go around, you know. The Black Lives Matter movement made zero difference. The cops still shot 3 people a day, you know, by count, not you know, probably more than that. So they killed 3 people a day by, you know, in terms of you know, what could be reckoned, and it's probably more than that, as I say. And that never varied, and it's still not varied. And you know, I mean, Biden and so on said, well, okay, we've got to have more cops, you know. What's come out of that? Oh, right, we'll carry on militarizing the cops and giving them more military stuff, you know, our sort of Pentagon spare stuff that they're supplying the cops with. So it's sort of they're developing this pressure cooker. But the problem is, of course, we're then not looking at a major political development from working class. I mean, you see bits and pieces and some important strikes and some movements towards unions, but I mean, not really a major political development, which is what we need. Yeah, thank you.
Should I respond, Tina?
If you want to, but we can take the next person. Yeah.
Well, that's very quickly. I agree with everything you said, Matt. You're absolutely correct. The Democrats you know, embraced Black Lives Matter in 2020, and many of them, you know, took up the cry to fund the police. Now every Democrat under the sun is proclaiming his or her love for the police, you know, calling for increased police budgets. I mean, it's completely just, you know, reprehensible. And essentially, the more democracy disappears, the more oligopoly rises. And that means, you know, the things get worse for the working class and the poor. You know, wealth polarizes, and workers get screwed in 1,001 different ways. And you're right that the labor has so far, there are small signs of a response to these reactionary policies, but so far it has not really taken off. The labor unions are completely bought into the Democratic Party. So they speak the Democratic Party's language. They utilize its logic, et cetera. They're an adjunct of the party, which is not to suggest, by the way, that Democrats are in any sense a labor party. They are not. They are a totally bourgeois party. So things are getting very bad, and as the political structure decays and slips into deeper and deeper into authoritarianism and oligopoly, we can expect expect conditions to continue declining. And you're right. I mean, Americans, Detroit is a burnt out hellscape. Los Angeles has armies of homeless people. Philadelphia is also a devastated town with immense poverty, and a 20-minute drive away, you'll find vastly wealthy suburbs with some of the finest schools on the planet, mansions, and everything. Where there's zero crime. It's completely outrageous, and it's getting worse.
Well, we're just talking about the Democrats and the conservatives. What about the Democratic Socialists of America? What role do they play at the moment?
Well, DSA is not only an architect of, it is an outgrowth of the idea that that essentially socialists in America should not even bother trying to build an independent movement. Their only hope lies as functioning as a faction of the Democratic Party. That was the theory on which DSA was built, and it places them in an awful position when people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez essentially embrace the U.S. war effort in the Ukraine. I mean, this goes way beyond the betrayal of 1914. I mean, these people are not never opposed the war, never opposed imperialism, and now are junior partners in the entire enterprise. It's completely shocking. There have been some minor eruptions in DSA over these policies, but still they haven't gone very far. I mean, my sense is the organization is losing its vim and vigor, and it's just subsiding into somnolence, and in a few years will turn into yet another left liberal pressure group, like so many others.
Thank you. Harry.
Yeah, hi, comrades. Harry from Ireland here. I mean, this was a very, very important election, and not just for the people in America, but right across Europe, and in fact, right across the world, because the prospect could have been very different indeed. The prospect is America would be turned into a sea of red, a red wall of Republicans, Trump, led by Trump. And this is no ordinary Republican Party. It's completely different. It's a far-right party. We can argue what it is, neo-fascist. To be honest with you, it's got all the hallmarks of a fascist party, an organization that, had things been different, it would have been the springboard for them, Trump in particular, to go for the presidency, control the other organs that Dan has mentioned. America would have been moving towards a fascist state, just like we see now in Italy. And that's how important this was. And the concern, as I say, for everyone throughout the world. Things of course have turned out very differently, because it was a severe blow to the Republican Party, to the far right movement in America, in particular a severe blow to Trump himself, because he was the one that endorsed so many of the candidates. He put his reputation online on this election. That's the question now. Have we seen now the end of Donald Trump? The media, I think probably, as far as I know, the media in America are actually saying, yes, it is. There seems to be an orientation now towards this Ron DeSantis. He's looking like there could be the one now to lead the Republican Party. They will have to reorganize, and they will reorganize again. They'll probably have to tone down their racist rhetoric and the denying of the elections. Perhaps, you know, the pro-life campaign, which was all of these kind of things will probably be toned down. I don't think we've seen the end of the far right by any means, but possibly Donald Trump himself. The media here in the West, in Britain, before the election, were all over this election. The expectation it would move towards a far right Republican victory. After the election, it was all played down. You had to go in, it was the third, fourth item in the BBC News after the election. And they've been playing the consequences of that election very much down here. The expectation did not turn out as much as it was. I don't think this was a real victory for the Democrat Party. It was seen as more a defeat for the Republican Party. I don't think anyone in America is really a pro-Biden or a pro-Democrat in this election. Biden himself is very, very unpopular. And when you look at his record to date, it hasn't changed that much from actually the Trump. In fact, even in the war against Russia, he's been actually more aggressive against Russia. It's possible even Trump wouldn't have even been that as much as the aggression against Russia in the foreign policy. But really, Biden has really changed very little. The immigration policy, the refugee policy is just as ruthless under Biden as it was under Trump. So I don't think things have really changed. The big question for the Democrats now is what do they do? Because they're not really showing fierce opposition to the Republican Party. Biden in the last only yesterday announced he would like to work more closely with the Republican Party. And although there's certainly a contested in a number of issues between Democrats and Republicans, I often feel that within the Democrat Party, there's a rather very soft opposition to the real Republican agenda. It's that there's an opposition, but it's not a fierce opposition. And even amongst Democrats, there's almost a little latent support even for this kind of a far right movement that is developing. You may disagree with that, Dan, but in America today, the far right movement is still very, very powerful, and they're organized. They've got thugs on the ground, armed at that were used in the election to intimidate voters, used very much against the likes of Nancy Pelosi, who played a very role, perhaps a prominent role in opposing the coup, directly targeted, openly threatened. And that's the nature of the politics of the Republican Party. In America itself, the question now is what about society itself? Despite about the president in Congress and so on and so forth, what happens? On the ground, I think there's a serious rise of a mass conflict, perhaps a civil conflict that is developing in America that could turn out to be very, very violent indeed to sort this out. American society between the right and the left is a conflict that I think is just waiting to happen. It could perhaps even breach into a kind of a civil war before this is all settled. Okay, Tina.
I'll quickly just respond, Tina, if it's okay. I agree with everything you said. I don't think the far right should be counted out. They suffered a setback. I expect that as conditions deteriorate and as the civil wars heat up on Capitol Hill, that it'll inject new life into the ultra right. And you're quite right that the Republican Party in general is moving in a farther and farther right-wing direction. We can have an interesting academic debate over whether it's fascist, semi-fascist, neo-fascist, quasi-fascist, or what. but it certainly is heading in an authoritarian direction. There's no doubt about that. And there's no doubt that as American government falls apart, American society falls apart. That's simply what's happening. I mean, you have a lot of aimless, hopeless souls wandering about in a fog on American streets. And it's very unfortunate. People, lives are being wasted as the fabric of society just simply unravels. And I think this process can only intensify.
Thank you. Tony is next.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, for a very interesting talk about the elections. It seems to me, I mean, it's profoundly depressing in a sense, because what you're describing the American inner cities is a dystopia. And yet those who are most affected, the homeless and so on, have absolutely no political expression. And for that matter, the working class, because they're trapped within the confines of two bourgeois parties, between whom there isn't a great deal of political difference. But I mean, American, in a sense, it seems that it never even had a bourgeois revolution, certainly not a complete one. And part of the reason for that, I see, is both a combination of its own role as a settler colonial society, allied with its imperialist role. And that's produced immense deformations and distortions within the body politic. But I mean, a couple of things I wanted to say. Firstly, AOC has said that in New York, the Republicans gained, or New York State, they gained considerably, and that was a result of a corrupt Democratic Party machinery that Andrew Cuomo left behind. So maybe you could comment on that, because New York has generally been a Democratic stronghold. But also, I'd be interested to know how the Squad did, and whether they have expanded or not. People like Ilhan Omar, Rashid Tlaib, I assume they all got elected. I know in the case of Jason Lee, I think it is, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, put in, I think, over $1 million to unseat her, and still failed. Maybe you could describe the actions of AIPAC, because AIPAC traditionally operated as a bipartisan group, but increasingly now it's a pro-Republican group, and in fact it's come under criticism for sponsoring and supporting about 100 Republicans who supported the insurrection on January the 6th. So I'd be interested in your take on that. I presume you would agree then that if the left is going to find its feet, it has to organize outside the Democratic Party, that there's no future for the left if it stays within the confines. I know there was a saying that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of all protest, and it would seem that that is playing out today. On the question of Trump, my own view, and of course you're nearer the ground, as it were, is that it's too soon to count Trump and his influence on the Republican Party out. He's nothing if not a wily politician. And I suspect we haven't heard the end of him, although he's suffered a defeat in the present elections. And finally, yes, I agree with you again on China, but I think China is going to be a much harder nut to crack, not least because it has a much more massive economic base than Russia. I mean, the problem for Russia is its economic base is relatively small, and it's finding it very difficult to sustain a prolonged war, coupled with what I think is a disastrous mistake by Putin, who fell into the trap of Biden in launching the war in the first place. So, yes, I'd be interested to hear some of your comments on the situation. Oh, and just one final one. It also seems to me that in the United States, amongst the three tiers of government, if you like, with the separation of powers, the Supreme Court has the final say on everything. It is the most powerful wing of the executive, in a sense. And it also seems, I mean, any bourgeois party worth its salt would then be challenging its right, in essence, to legislate without any mandate electorally. But of course, if you're wedded to the Constitution, you can't do that. So thank you.
Sure. Okay, there's a lot of ground, Tony. I'll sort of take it in reverse order. The Supreme Court is a hugely powerful institution. It is more or less the final word. It is completely undemocratic. As I said, 4 of the 6 conservative justices were appointed by unelected presidents, and 4 were then confirmed by senators representing a minority of the population. So this is minority rule in its purest. And yes, they have handed down the abortion ruling was devastating. They're gonna hand down a ruling probably next June, which could actually, believe it or not, actually eliminate the popular vote more or less in presidential elections. The case is Harper v. Moore. It would give the states far more leverage in determining how presidential elections are conducted in those states, and shift power from the people to the state legislatures, most of which are controlled by the Republican Party. But you can't say anything because this constitutional edifice is so totalitarian, so all-encompassing, that you can't move one little brick without the whole thing toppling down. So therefore, everybody is determined not to move one little brick, and so no one criticizes the Supreme Court on constitutional grounds. You simply can't go there. I agree, China is much harder not to crack. I was going to say, by the way, that actually, although Trump may seem like a peacenik compared to the Democrats, he actually has been more militantly anti-China than the Democrats have been. But of course, that situation is very dangerous. And in terms of foreign policy continuity, Biden has carried out Trump policy to the letter in the Persian Gulf. I mean, vis-a-vis Iran, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, the JCPOA. Trump abandoned that, and the Biden administration has made a show of resurrecting it, but has not done a thing, and that treaty is dead. And Biden is happy to see it go. So he's following Trump's foreign policy to the letter. And Israel is always fascinating. We're seeing the Kahanism of AIPAC, and as the more it's Kahanified, the more it allies itself with the Republican right wing, which is opposed by roughly 70% or even more of American Jews. American Jews are very successful, very affluent, but if there's one thing the great majority of American Jews agree upon, with the exception of a few Orthodox outliers, is that America needs democracy and anti-racism for the Jews to survive, and AIPAC is working more and more overtly against that. They are allying with the racist, undemocratic right in a way that horrifies. So that the two communities, the two biggest Jewish communities in the world, are heading out in completely opposite directions. And it'll be fascinating to see how this plays out. The squad, by the way, were all reelected. I would and just raise one point about settler colonialism. This is a really interesting point, because actually I would argue that is one element in America's political development. But I would argue that America was a country which essentially invented. It shares this honor with the Caribbean, the industrial proletariat. In other words, beginning in the 17th century, the early 17th century, when North America was first settled, they developed an enslaved proletariat who who worked in a proto-industrial fashion, harvesting rice, tobacco, and then later cotton, and that it was these areas which grew more vigorously in the 17th and 18th century than the free labor settler North. And so the question of settlerism has to be sort of kept in perspective because of this really fascinating and really important proto-proletarian, proto-industrial legacy that essentially manifested itself in the Caribbean and the North American mainland, starting in the 16th century in the Caribbean and in the 17th century on the mainland. So those are two very important factors. Anyway, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you. Diana, please.
Just might going to make a comment on something that you, Dan, and Tony have already touched on a bit. Tony mentioned the Democrat corruption in New York. Recently, I saw a video with Scott Ritter on it. I think he lives in New York State or New York, I'm not sure which, going on about how the Democrat-run legislator in New York had changed the rules to prevent a third non-Democrat, non-Republican party from standing. So that says to me, I was going to post a link to that video. I couldn't find it. I'd have to spend time finding it again. But that says to me that the whole system, it's not just you've got these two big parties like you've got in Britain that are controlled by wealthy corporations, but the system is rigged so that anyone can just prevent another party from standing. So I was wondering what your comment is on that.
You're 110% correct. Not only is the game rigged to prevent any third parties from taking part, but those restrictions have actually increased tremendously over the last 50 years. So when you go to vote, you have a choice between two parties and two parties only. One rabidly right-wing, heading off in a semi-fascist direction, and the other one kind of a center-right party, which has sort of become the party of neoconservatism. And there are no alternatives, none. Back in the 70s, some socialist groups, such as the Socialist Workers' Party, a different party in the US than it is in the UK, were able to field candidates. But actually, since then, the restrictions have risen. So if you combine those stiffening restrictions with a weakening left, essentially in terms of electoral politics, the socialists have effectively disappeared. So we have a perfect bourgeois dictatorship, one where there's total freedom to speak and write as you please, but absolutely no alternative whatsoever, at least in terms of ostensible electoral politics, to go against this thoroughly bourgeois government.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Diane. Steve, please.
Hi, Dan. Thanks very much for that talk. And also, I share quite a bit of your analysis, I would say. But I'm doing it from a slightly different angle because I think here in England, we're the follower of America. It's like you're big America and we're little America, and so we need to know in a little America where we're going next. And some people in little America think it would be great if we had a republic. And then people think, well, if we had a republic, it would be like the horror story you've just described. It would be absolutely appalling. And therefore, we better stay where we are and keep our constitutional monarchy, because the horror show you've described seems absolutely terrible. But we can learn a heck of a lot by watching the state of play that you're on, because people don't know this, but we've got a Supreme Court now. And also we've got city mayors. Some cities have got mayors. You know, we sound more and more like we're copying America. We're copying all the worst bits of America. None of the advantages that you may have got, we got all the worst bits here to be added on. I mean, you've got a Senate, we've got House of Lords. You know what I mean? How ridiculous is that? So if we were to follow you, we'd be like going from 1707 to like, I don't know, 1789. You know, somebody think, well, great, if we could go from 1707 to 1789. Obviously, that is a completely ridiculous idea. I mean, Marx said in the 19th century that the American federal constitution was a barrier to progress. It already was. Federalism was out of date. And that the constitution, as you say, is a brake on social progress, because in a way you've got probably got the biggest working class in the world, the most developed, sophisticated working class in the world, and yet the constitution's absolutely designed to make sure that that cannot impact itself on a government of America. So what you're getting there is something I can see here. You've got a crisis of democracy, which is, I suppose, it's two things. It's a failure of the political system and the democratic deficit. Are those two things together give you the situation you've got in America? So all those words that you said, gridlock, immobilized, paralysis, backward, out of date, etc., we could apply all of those things here in little America, right? We've got them, we've got our own versions of them. And in this crisis of democracy, it's interesting. Biden was talking and made a powerful case for the defense of democracy. That was one of his arguments I heard him making. But I think Trump was making the same argument. He said, we got to defend American democracy because otherwise the Antifa and the radical left will take over and our constitution will be taken away. So both of them are defending this democracy, this American so-called democracy. Now, Simon Marx, who's the LBC US correspondent, he follows politics very carefully. He made this point. He said, Biden is talking about the defense of democracy, but he doesn't have any democratic program. He doesn't have a single idea about what should be done about this failing, paralyzed, immobilized, gridlock democracy. And I think that's where the left has to, if it's going to make any progress, it has to take up the argument for a different republic than the one that you've got. In other words, you need a new republic in America. And it's not true because you've got a republic that there's not a case for a republic. I mean, the one you've got is, as you described, so terrible, like the one we've got. I don't know what one we've got. We've still got a monarchy, our republic, and we've sort of like a banana republic or something like that we've got here. So we've got, and of course, all of those anti-democratic things feed into imperialism that you were talking about. You have this very, very powerful presidential executive power, which we've got here in the form of the crown, by the way. I mean, that's the way our executive works. And that enables the American president to wage all these wars as he has been doing. So I agree with you in one sense, unreformable, but I think that would be a bit pessimistic. I think there has to be the left has to come up with a reform program in order to convince people that only by some sort of democratic revolution would it be possible to break out of this system that we've got. So we have to put forward concrete constitutional proposals in order to mobilize the working class to see that their interests do not lie in maintaining the American constitutional setup as it is. And I finish by saying that I believe that here in little America, where we are all sitting, we have to follow that same kind of approach to politics. Not to have we don't want the American system, but we do want a system which is a really democratic republic and a social republic that looks after the welfare of the people in this country. So I think maybe we're marching big America, little America. I hope we're marching in the same direction. I think we probably are.
As an internationalist, I believe that the proletarians of all nations should unite, and that they will unite. The relationship between reform and revolution is an interesting one. as a child of the 60s, I was sort of grew up thinking that, that reform was slow and revolution was fast. So people who were patient and careful went for reform. Those who were impatient and impassioned went for revolution. But in point of fact, that was completely incorrect. Essentially, America is rushing backwards so rapidly that the only way to achieve the mildest reform is via revolution. I mean, if you just, if you want, if you want police who don't, beat up poor people to a pulp, the only way to do that is not by passing an ordinance in your local municipality. It's by overthrowing the entire thing, because the entire structure is so completely regressive that regressive quality is manifesting itself in myriad ways that penetrate the wall of society. And there simply is no recourse, nothing that can be done under the present rotten system, which is just rotten, corrupt, racist. You mentioned the Senate. The Senate is based on equal state representation. 54% of the country lives in 10 states that are outvoted 4-1 by the minority in the other 40. But something like 82% of minorities live in those 10 states, where they are therefore outvoted in an overtly racist manner. I mean, the racism. Now, racism is not a matter of attitudes; it's a matter of deep political structures, and the deep political structures in America are profoundly racist, profoundly inequitable, undemocratic, etc. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you. Ian is our last contributor, and then you can have a little rest. You've been going non-stop. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks. I think I posted in the chat, seeming a long time ago now, about Tulsi Gabbard, just simultaneously as you mentioned her, how she demolished Kamala Harris. So perhaps great minds think alike. I saw a response back shortly after that about how she's collapsed to the far right since leaving the Democrats. I'm not sure if it's as simple as that. She left, it seems, over some good reasons. Above all, she passes the very low bar that so few do of opposing nuclear war. But she has also said some pretty concerning things, talking about anti-white racism. The one that always gets me is she's accused Biden of running an open borders policy. Now, whatever you think of Biden, who I don't like, whatever you think of an open borders policy, which I don't see as the scarecrow that some people would, it's simply not true that he's running that policy. He's running effectively the same policy as Trump, with maybe very minor changes, mainly in tone. So it's worrying that she's saying that simply from the perspective of honesty. Again, the Florida law that she supports on don't say gay in school, we had that in Britain. It was actually abolished 20 years ago. She says it should be extended to like 18, which is bizarre. I think it's mainly about trans. But the idea that you could be kept unaware of a whole minority because your parents don't want you to know about it when you're an adult yourself at 16, 17, 18 seems again absurd. But I think she does seem, Gabbard, to represent this kind of post-left tendency. And when you look at the official left, the squad, their apology for this very mild letter for negotiations, Jayapal throwing her their admin assistant under the bus, saying it was released in error and it had been written months ago, though it referenced things that had happened weeks or days ago, so it wasn't even true. So this complete cowardice and collapse into supporting imperialist war of the official left, you can see why some people want to reach beyond, if that's the only left on offer, reach beyond the left. Yeah, what do you think are the prospects for Tulsi Gabbard and the kind of people that she represents? And is there a chance of a left that could be more convincing to those people and to the audience they're talking to. Because it seems that the left right now is so split between either you oppose a fascistic coup in Kiev in 2014 that Joe Biden supported, was one of the organizers behind the scenes for, and therefore minimize a fascistic coup that failed, that Biden was the target of, or the other way around. You oppose the coup against Biden and support the coup that he supported. And of course, fascism and coups are too important a subject to really judge solely by their relationship to the here today, probably very much gone tomorrow politician Joe Biden, and how to bridge that kind of culture war on the left that reflects a culture war in the establishment between the Republicans, the right, who are frankly hurtling towards and willfully blind to the extinction level danger of climate change, and then the extreme center, what passes as the left in American discourse, that are hurtling towards and willfully blind to the even more immediate extinction level danger of nuclear war if their policy towards Russia goes too far. So yeah, we've gone from the heights of Bernie Sanders, for all the disagreements we might have with him, that seem to have got more serious of late, almost winning or being cheated out of the presidency, the Democrat ballot line twice, to this. And what are the chances, if Biden doesn't run again, if Harris is a really crap choice, for either Bernie to run again, someone like AOC to run, or someone like Tulsi, or is it all kind of past that and the left defeated for another period? And in terms of Trump and DeSantis, is it possible that DeSantis could be even worse than Trump? I've seen his ad where he says, on the 8th day, God created me, without even being tongue-in-cheek. So yeah, I'm sure there was something else I wanted to ask too, but these are maybe enough to get on with at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, DeSantis seems to be the new golden child. It'd be interesting to hear a bit more.
Yeah, he actually did very well in Florida. He won by 10 or 20 points districts that Biden had won, that Hillary Clinton had won. Florida's a funny state because it's flipped, and usually in America the North is liberal and the South is conservative, but in Florida the North is conservative and the South is very heavily Jewish, very heavily filled with New York retirees, and therefore it's kind of a transplant of New York politics down in the Miami area. But he swept those areas. He did very, very well, very powerful performance. And yeah, he's the new golden boy, and he's got to be. He has Trump worried, clearly. So the leadership of the Republican Party is very much in play. But he's horrible, of course. I mean, let me say that. And I saw that God on the 8th day ad. It's astonishing. But the only thing is I just don't think his politics really will work in the country as a whole, because he's too Southern. Remember, Trump is a New Yorker. And I think that culturally and rhetorically, Trump resonates with a broader portion of the population than a Southerner does. These cultural differences are very important in America, very powerful, and they're not easily overcome. The Civil War.
Sorry, I've remembered my last question, and it sort of relates to our predicament in Britain. Which is about the Democrat ballot line, maybe to be devil's advocate compared to some of the other contributions tonight. But given what we've just heard about the decline of the left and the tightening of the restrictions on third parties, but also because of the structure of American politics being so different, where the party is, at the end of the day, just a ballot line that different candidates can fight over in the primaries. Bernie was cheated, but he was only like in just over the people who cheated him. In fact, in the second time, he was on about 25% as the front runner, and then all the others ganged up on him. With Clinton, he was just edging her out, and then the superdelegates and all that edged him out, and it wasn't run in a fair way. But an overwhelming movement, like with Jeremy Corbyn, could it possibly overwhelm even more within the Democrats and within the Labour Party? Because we wouldn't have the problem that's happened to a lot of people on this call, including myself, that you can take away their party membership. Bernie Sanders has never even been a registered Democrat, for example. And what, on the other hand, with the Squad, with the collapse into pro-war opinion, given that the Democrats are in the new party of the neocons since the Trump era, is it structural that AOC and the Squad and all the others have collapsed in this way over Ukraine? Is it almost inevitable given their being in the Democrats? Or could you have a better set of politicians and a different kind of more class organized movement that could go for the Democrat ballot line, but be a bit more disciplined and not politically collapse in that way, and perhaps provide a better example of leftism to the people who might be getting into all sorts of rabbit holes and confusion?
Well, the Democrats are not a party. That's the problem.
Exactly.
There literally is, there's no rank and file, there's no membership. You can't join the Democratic Party. I mean, if
or
you
be
walk
expelled
out,
from it.
Or be expelled. If you walk down to the local headquarters, you say like, I want to, join the party, pay dues and get a membership card, they will be dumbfounded. They have no idea what you are talking about. So it's a milieu of academics, Hollywood stars, feminists, Black politicians, this and that, all jostling for power. But there's no rank and file. The rank and file has no input into policy. It's fragmentation upon fragmentation. So the idea of taking over this mob it's just not going to work. It'll still be a mob. It's just not. I mean, democracy is party democracy. Parties are at the core of any true democracy. And the parties in America are so underdeveloped that they really aren't even parties at all. So this is just an example of the backward, undemocratic nature of US politics. I mean, I know it sounds very grim. I've lived in this country all my life. I've struggled to understand it. And its politics are profoundly dysfunctional. And the society is profoundly dysfunctional. So it's going to take a whole, and given the extreme age of American political institutions, I mean, you're dealing with a society that's that's almost czarist in its conservatism. It's going to take a clean sweep before you can accomplish anything at all. The blackboard has got to be erased. And if you have to start working, as a math student, you've got to erase the blackboard and go to work on a mathematical problem on a clean board. And that's what it takes. The politics now are so wretched, so suffocating, and so totalitarian that they have to be rejected in toto. And by the way, about Tulsi Gabbard, she's kind of part of the radical center. I don't know if you're aware of it. She grew up in a Hindu household, and is very much a follower of Modi, of Hindutva in India, and so she's conservative religiously. She's conservative sexually. In terms of foreign policy, she is anti-Sunni Islam, but pro-Shiite, so therefore is friendly to the Assad government in Syria, very hostile, obviously, to Pakistan. So that's kind of how her politics work. Americans don't understand those nuances. I don't blame them. India's a country very far away. But essentially, I think it's best to think of her as the candidate of the politician of Hindutva, as somehow transferred into an American context.
Thank you very much, Dan, for answering all these many questions. I think it's been one of the most vibrant webinars we had for a while. As you say, it is for Brits, it's people living in Britain, it is quite difficult to understand what's going on in America and vice versa. I mean, it's not as not much more democratic here in Britain at the moment. Just one final question really is sort of how I mean, in Britain, the sort of industrial struggles are slowly reviving now, nurses going on strike, etc. And inflation, as in America, is extremely high and people are really suffering quite a bit now. Is there something similar happening in the US?
Not nearly as much. There's certain similar stirrings. Interestingly enough, they take place among kind of déclassé petty bourgeois. I'm thinking of people who work in Starbucks, in some of the tech companies, et cetera, young kids who are highly educated, who lean left and who are underpaid. And they have been some of the first to stir. The campaign to organize Amazon has had one great success and a number of setbacks. Bear in mind, labor law in America is so completely geared to the corporations that it is impossible is too strong a word. It's extremely difficult to organize a union in a shop or a factory. It's amazing. Even 50 years ago, when I did a bit of union organizing, it was much easier. But now it's very difficult.
On that happy note,
right.
I mean, as you say, I mean, things can, turn over quite quickly and can go a different direction quite quickly, depending on, things happening. Trying to find a positive somewhere. But thank you very much for joining us. That was very, very interesting. Next week, we're continuing our series, Life of the Left, when Ed Bobo will be introducing, who will he be introducing? It's just escaped me. Ted Grant. Okay, see you next week, comrades. Have a good evening. Bye-bye. Thank you, Dan.